Welcome to the Thinklings podcast, a conversation where good thoughts help renew the mind with the Word of God. I'm Charlie Carter, and I'm here with Tim Little and Andy Stearns. Let's jump into the conversation. In a hole in the seminary basement, there lived a podcast. So we just were talking about that earlier. We thought that'd be really fun to start the podcast that way.
The Thinklings podcast.
Yeah, just like a hobbit, which a retirement dream of mine is to have a hobbit house.
Oh,
Like
they're
an
awesome.
actual, like built into the side of a hill, big green round door, and like all the little tunnels.
Have you seen those Airbnbs that are doing that? Like,
Yeah.
I just want to go to one.
I saw something.
You
on,
guys are
I
ridiculous.
saw something on Facebook or Instagram about one of these out in like Idaho or Colorado or Utah, somewhere out
Yeah,
there.
I think I saw the same one.
And of course we did, because
Mets. Yeah,
I mean, the
that's right.
algorithm, they're all
Oh,
pumping us
yeah.
the same things. But I looked at that on Airbnb. To book that one, you'd have to book like at least like 13 or 14 months out.
Oh,
Yeah, it's
whoa.
great. Like they're making a killing, I'm sure. It's a great idea. I mean, anyone who's a Hobbit fan, who doesn't want to live in a Hobbit hole? But anyway, so this is not a typical episode. If you haven't already figured that out, we're not going to have a normal books and business
Books and business.
moment of silence. Sorry, no books and business. But we are going to talk about books, just not in the normal way. Way back when, almost, what would that be? Math is hard. 63 episodes ago. That's crazy, by the way. 63, so almost to 70 episodes. Whew, retirement age.
Yeah, we are.
They grow up so fast. But, so episode 6 was titled Some Thinklings Thoughts on Reading. So if you've read the title of this episode, you've noticed it's Some More Thinklings Thoughts on Reading. And so it's a new year. We're just getting into February, and maybe you want to read more books this year. So we just want to talk about practical tips to help you read more. Some thoughts on reading that, maybe they're helpful to you, maybe they're not, but that's what we're going to do. We're going to go around the table and share some practical tips on reading. So anyone want to go first?
I can go first.
Boom.
So here's one tip that I try to recommend to students. So there's different kinds of reading, and there's different genres. So you have fiction and nonfiction, and even within those broad categories, you have, splintered, especially in the nonfiction category. I'm going to talk about nonfiction reading. And so one tip that I tell students as they're trying to read for content in a nonfiction title is to just breeze through a chapter and look at the headings. Most books are written with headings, and you can get a general idea where the author is going in the chapter just based upon the headings. Okay? And then once you see where somebody's going, you can engage the author more as you read through the material. Okay? So one tip in reading, first, just look at the headings and blast through the chapter. By the way, you can start at the very beginning of the whole book. And of course, what are all the headings to the whole book? The chapter titles. All right. So that would be another level of this. But just getting into one chapter, look at the headings and just blast through it. Maybe and read the intro and the conclusion. And you should generally have an idea what the author is trying to say in that chapter.
So if I have a book I really want to get into, I do that. And I have a number of outlines on my computer, and I literally just type out the headings. And if you make a standardized outline, Roman numeral 1, chapter 1, subheading A is your subheadings. You'll even get down into like the 1, 2, 3, third levels, and then just go back and read the outline and think about like, okay, what's he saying? What's she saying? What's the argument? That helps my brain, and that's going to go with one of my tips here in a minute. It helps my brain build a skeleton to hang all that information on. So that is a huge tip. I think that's a good one. I'll just dive in actually with one of my tips. So for me, anytime I read a book, my first question is not conceptual. And this is going back to Adler's book, How to Read a Book. I don't want to know what the concepts mean. I don't want to understand what the author's trying to say. My first concern is structural. So Tim, your outline method, huge. For me, I will always read the table of contents and try to figure out what am I going to be told. If your mind doesn't know like what's coming, then you're not going to retain anything. And I think that's part of my retention problem through the past. I would read a book, like it was a novel. I just go page by page without doing any research. And you really gotta, what do you want to call it? Like you digest the book as you read it, but it's like you're at the buffet and you're taking a sample along the whole row. Maybe is that what you'd say?
You need to ask the author questions as you're reading. So then it's like you're interacting with the argumentation. So it's like, why is he saying this? What's the purpose of this section? Or how does that
Well,
prove his argument? So it's like engaging the mind.
so I think you're actually, at least what you started off talking about, Andy, I think you're talking about two different things.
Yeah, that's totally separate.
Sorry.
So like
He jumped
talking
into
about
another tip.
this is, so the reason this keys in my mind, sorry, I just snapped right next to my microphone, is Kaiser, when he talks about a method of exegesis, his first step, there's like that grammatical, historical interpretation idea, and he changes it. He's like, just so we don't misunderstand how someone else used this term, he's like, I'm gonna come up with my own, and he calls it a structural theological method. And so his first attempt at biblical exegesis is only grasping structure
Yes.
and not thinking about the theology yet. So you get the grammar and the flow, the diagram of it, and then you come back to that skeleton that you've crafted, and you're like, okay, now here's the main sentence. What does that mean? And how do these other things play into it? And so actually, I really like that, both as a biblical method, but that just for like an academic technical source, like thinking through structure. If it's like Lord of the Rings, you don't do that.
No.
Because like read the story. Just read the story.
Yep.
But for an academic book or a more thinky, heavy type of an idea translation, starting with structures really good.
And I would say there's two parallels. So if you think of the best Bible study method out there, the observation, interpretation, application method, that's just observation. I tell students, you don't ask what the Bible means at the observation level. You just want to know what it says. And essentially, when you're doing an outline, that's what you're making. And then Greg Kokel in Apologetics, when you're having a conversation, his first question is, what do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? You're not actually saying you disagree or agree. You just want to know. So I think it's like a level of observation for your mind.
So asking questions of the author would then be an outflowing that'd be more detailed in that reading process, understanding the structure of the argument. And then, so this is one of the tips that I try to recommend to students is that when you're reading, if you've gone through the chapter and just looked at the headings, then ask the author questions because they're trying to answer certain questions as they're writing. And then that's going to engage your mind. If you don't have any questions that you're expecting the author to answer, then your mind is not being engaged and you're going to be daydreaming and thinking of, the basketball game or some attraction or whatever else.
So you actually you mentioned a basketball game. Like I often see, or I've been around faith for 12 years now, which is not a drop in the pan, but I've often observed students taking books to athletic events as if they're going to read them at the basketball game.
I've read books at basketball games.
I mean, it's like you're not setting yourself up for success, Carter? At that point.
What are you saying?
Like you just made a point about like just being lackadaisical or distracted while you read, and then you're like, oh, I'm going to watch a game and then read at the same time. Now, I will say
maybe the intention isn't to really watch a game, Carter.
I don't know. That seems like a slam dunk of a plan to me.
Who knows? I mean, just why would you want to read something in a distracted sense like that?
Want to go to a basketball game?
That's a valid point. So let's get back to tips on reading. And you mentioned something like, so there was this assignment that Dr. Doug Brown, also known as Santa Claus on our podcast, there was an assignment that he would give out in hermeneutics for years, and he doesn't do it anymore because enough people sufficiently complained. And that was this book by Kevin Van Hooser. Is there a meaning in the text? Is there a meaning in the text or something
such
like
a
that?
good book.
It's a very large book on hermeneutics, which is theory. And it's hard to read hermeneutical theory. And he would give this assignment of outlining the book. Now, not at all telling him what we think. It's not an analysis at all. It was outlining what he was saying. And at the time, you're like, why am I doing this? It's actually a genius assignment because he's forcing you to think through the structural ideas that the author's giving you, like outlining it in your mind and then being able to reproduce it in a written form. It's like he's helping you take the first steps of really getting what's there. And I'm not sure if I still have that assignment somewhere. Be really interested to go back and look at mine, but like that's kind of what we're talking about right there is taking time to do that. But then I can hear the student screaming or the pastor or the mom, all of which are busy people. So I have to read it twice. I got to read through it once and just think about the structure. And then I got to read it again to think about what it means. I don't have time to read the book twice. What would you say to that?
I'd say you haven't really read it.
Yeah.
So the people that just like read every word, okay, they aren't really reading the book. They're getting a check mark on an assignment. When I assign a book to be read, what I just explained to you is how I would expect you to read it. And I wouldn't expect you to read every word. I would expect you to be able to read through the book and ascertain the general ideas, asking the author questions about the book, all of that. That's like how you read. That's how you should read everything.
It's a thinking exercise.
Correct.
Yes.
And if you're not engaging with the actual argument or thought of the author, and we've all done this. I did it too when I was in classes. I'm like, well, I said to read every single word. Well, I better read every single word. I just went through 5 pages. I have no idea what any of it was about, but I made it through the 5 pages and I ain't going back.
Which is why the systematic skim can help you people.
So what I've just purported or tried to explain to you is going to make your reading more helpful, valuable, faster. Okay. And
It's
it's the way it's supposed to be. So a lot of times I'll read through the whole headings and then I'll get to a section and I'm just like, I know what this guy is saying here. Okay. And
Yep.
so then I'm just reading like the first sentence of a paragraph to see if he's saying something different. And I'm done. I'm moving on.
well, what's very common in books is they will make a point right away. And then many paragraphs to follow are all supporting that same point.
Right.
Mhm.
That's good writing style. That's what you're looking for. Is
But
that
so if
first
you've
point.
already grabbed the concept,
Correct.
do you need to grab
Mhm.
every argument for the concept?
No, if you're already
No.
agreeing with his
Yeah.
main point, his premise, then you're done, and then you move on to the next
Maybe just
section.
apologize in advance to any undergrad professors that do want, or graduate level, that want them to read every word. So listen to the
Well,
syllabus.
We're
But
not guiding students exactly here. We're trying to promote
Yeah.
a
In general,
culture of reading
real
to
life,
just
yeah.
real life people.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And so if you're stuck reading all the time, it's probably because you're not reading the right way. So you read for content and for information. You're
Mhm.
trying to answer a specific question when you're reading. So what is that question? Go after the question, and
Yes.
then you're done if you've answered the question.
and just to put this into practical terms, I think I can easily now, when I look at a structure of what an author's trying to do, this is Duvall and Hayes, and they're
Yep.
preaching God's
Yes.
word. You're hanging a clothesline, and you're hanging things on the clothesline. They're looking at that from like a preaching a text type of it, but like when you go through and you pull out that outline or that structure, it's a clothesline for which you to hang ideas on later. And when you start off with that, you understand the map of where everything's going to go. It really does help you read faster. And you should not approach every book as page 1 to page X and you just chronologically read it. Especially academic works, because they're not built to function that way.
Mhm.
And so, if you'd have told me early on in my academic career, early college or like late high school, even I mean deeper into college, like you could easily read multiple 100 pages a day. Like you're nuts. It takes me way too long. I can't do that. But if you know how to look at the book and you have that clothesline to hang ideas on, I mean, it is very doable to read multiple 100 pages a day, and it doesn't feel like you're burdening yourself with this like huge burden. You're just exhausted at the end of it. Like it's very common for me before I get to work now to read through 50 pages and not even really blink at it because you're not reading every word.
It's what remember How to Read a Book.
Yeah.
Mortimer Adler has like the levels of reading. This what you were talking about is the difference between elementary reading, which is literally just sounding out the words,
See,
and
spot, run.
yeah. and then what he would call like you have pre-reading, and then you have like much higher levels of reading where you're looking for
What
content.
philosophical ideas does Spot have as he runs?
Do I agree with running in general? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there are different kinds of works and books that you are reading, and what we're prescribing is what I would call like
Genre study.
okay. So what we're describing right now is like the regular Christian living, the stuff that that's mostly on the shelves of like Faith Bookstore. Okay. But if you get like, I remember one student, he was really struggling and he brought Erickson's Christian Theology in. And so I sat down and there's like not many headings and they're very,
Yeah.
epistemology or ontology. And he's like, I don't even know what those things are. And I'm like, yeah, well, okay, this is a different kind of reading.
Being and
All right.
knowing.
You're
being and
not
knowing.
gonna be able to just do what we just talked about with Erickson's Christian Theology, especially his introductory chapters where he's explaining why epistemology first systems don't work and you need to subscribe to an ontology first philosophy. I mean, probably most of our listeners had no idea what I just said. Okay.
Gesundheit.
So when you're reading that kind of literature, sometimes, and this has happened to in a class that Andy and I both took, you actually have to sometimes get out different colors of pens.
Mhm.
Okay. And you're literally sometimes diagramming out the argumentation
Which
of
is,
the author 1 page at a time.
and that's structure. Back to that
Yes.
structural.
That is, but it's at a very minute level as opposed to the whole chapter is going to be at like a page by page level.
Well, think about it like it's like a brick wall. Each of those bricks fit together, and you get one row of bricks, and then you have 3 or 4 rows of bricks, and eventually you have a whole wall. And here you have chapters and paragraphs and sentences and words. And guess what? You slowly start piecing it together. Eventually, you're going to understand what the author's saying.
Correct.
Mhm.
So that component right there was one book that Andy and I both had to read for, it was a PhD level class, Gadamer
Yeah. By Georgia Warnke.
by
Mm.
Warnke. And we literally would read a page and not have a clue what we were reading. Like, I have no idea. I read it, like we would read it out loud.
Yep.
Okay. And we're like, I have no idea what they're talking about. Okay.
It's true.
It was the same way with Saving the Appearances by Owen Barfield. I remember we got together at a reading group and we just had us all around the table. And so I had one person, I said, why don't you read this page? And they read through it. And then I was just like, okay, does anybody have any clue what they're talking about? I mean, I think everybody at the table thought we were just going to keep going. But then when I asked that question, they just are like,
Yep.
I haven't a clue.
Well,
We had no idea what he was saying.
We went straight from alpha to
he
beta
was
get
out there,
thinking.
though.
He was.
Right. So then everybody had to go back to the beginning of the paragraph and we were literally start diagramming out the paragraph to figure out what he was
Barfield
saying.
is incredibly esoteric and mystical, and some of his ideas quite literally aren't founded. And so, like, there are times when I think like that is just a reasonable conclusion. Is like, I don't know what in the world.
So at the same time, there's a value to making your brain think that hard and to creep
Yeah.
through it. And so I would encourage you to read Saving the Appearances by Owen Barfield or even Warnke's.
I'm actually going to go back and read that again.
I don't
But
want
I'll
to.
talk about that in a minute.
Warnke.
by
I'll talk about that in a little
Gadamer
bit.
by Warnke or whatever.
So maybe let's pause there for a moment. And we've talked a lot of, I think the last 20 minutes of discussion is taking a wide angle lens perspective on what you're reading, thinking through what type of reading you're doing, and based on the type of reading, approaching it a little differently.
Mhm.
So like an academic work, structural analysis can be very helpful at the beginning, understanding what the author's trying to do, where they're going. Probably not as important for narrative. So there's a lot of discussion there. But then actually, what are you doing as you're reading? We kind of talked about that. So I'm about to pivot. That's why I'm summarizing. Try to effective communication, right?
Good.
So here's a tip that I'd like to give. It's just an extended metaphor. And it's true. This principle, this wisdom idea, is true of many categories of life. Difficult things get easier the more you do them.
Mm.
Okay. If you want to go work out, I'm going to go work out in just a little bit here, and I'm going to try and lift a whole bunch of weight. And, I've been diligently trying to get stronger, lifting weights for probably like 8-9 months consistently now. And so I'm much stronger than I was when I started. And I have tracked it. I know how much stronger I am. If you're not a consistent, routine reader, you're not going to jump into high level reading tomorrow. You're just not. And so the practical tip here is kind of from that idea of hard things get easier the more you do them. So repetition is wise. From that idea, I'm going to latch 2 other practical steps is to set goals and have a routine. So having goals, having a routine, and with the routine side of it, I would just say if you really want to read, get better at reading, just never take a day off. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to read 50 pages or 100 pages a day. There's days you just don't have time for that. And so if you really want to improve in reading, just make the commitment, even if it's just 1 page. 1 page. I'm going to grab The Hobbit off the shelf and I'm going to read 1 more page. You read that day, and you build the routine of reading every day. Now, pause there for a moment. Hopefully, many of our listeners are already doing that with scripture. And if you're not, hey, I'm going to read at least 1 paragraph of my Bible every day. That's reading too. Very different type of reading than Erickson's theology or Warnke on Gadamer, but probably more beneficial than those things.
Definitely.
But so the routine is don't take a day off. And over time, what do you find? Is that you're doing way more than you used to. And it's because you're slowly building up that, it's not a real muscle, but that muscle memory of reading, that diligence in the routine. And, we could digress into a discussion of, well, really that's a battle of desires. Like you have competing desires. I don't want to read. I want to do other things. Well, that's good too. But just for now, read a page, just commit to reading a page a day. And that's where I'm at right now. And some days it's like 5 pages. And then there's other days you just, you have more time, you get on a roll, you start to love what you're reading, you love the study, and 1 page becomes 100 really quick. So the routine, and what was the other side of it? Goals, setting a goal.
Goals. Yeah, goals, you said.
Here's why you set a goal. It's not so you can be like, oh, wow, look, I did this thing. But maybe if you can hear the tone, like, oh, wow, I did that thing. I don't know if you can hear the tone difference. One is prideful and one is really thankful.
Mhm.
And why I like goals is because when you meet goals, you see growth. It's one of the greatest motivators. And so I can look back and like, hey, I had this goal and look at how much I've read. Like, and it gets you excited that you've done something that you haven't done previously. And so, there's all the practical wisdom tips of, it's not realistic to say, I'm going to read, 5 million pages this year. No, you're not. But if you set a reasonable goal of, I want to read, how many books did you read last year total? You're like, I read 5 books. Well, I'd like to read 10 books this year. And if you know that a book should be determined by 207 pages, because that's the average of the original Lord of the Rings, then, okay, math is hard. 20,000 pages? I do that? No, 2,000 pages.
Don't ask me.
Yeah. 207 times 10, 2070. Math. So like, I'm going to read 2,100 pages this year. And you keep track of that and you get there. You're like, wow, that's awesome. I did more than I've ever done. And you tracking that goal and that success is a motivator, and it's helpful. So those would be the two ideas for me. There is, harder things get easier the more you do them. And so I think that is a practical tip of wisdom, right? Maybe you guys would agree.
I would.
Looking at Tim over here, our Proverbs.
agree.
Yeah, so this is the whole, like, you're creating a godly habit. You're
Yeah.
putting off the old man and saying, oh, you know what? Part of the new man is to think better. Reading helps me think better. I'm going
Amen.
to put on the new man. What does
Yeah.
that look like? I have to practice it. And it's just like playing a musical instrument. You can say that you're a pianist, but if you don't ever practice, you're not a pianist. You could say you're a reader, but if you're never reading, then you're not a reader. Okay? You have to do it. And that's what Charlie's really prescribing is you need to do it.
And I think that there's some, a ramp up to that in our thinking. If you're desiring to read more and you're not following through, maybe you've kind of come to, and this is with any resolution, really, any like goal you set, you don't meet it. Eventually, there is a competition of desires, and it's not that you wanted to do one thing, but you really wanted to do something else more. And so maybe the test of that goal is, yeah, I really want to read 10 books, but also really want to rewatch that show on Netflix.
Unsubscribe.
Yeah, well, and that's, if that's what you're recognizing is that there's a competition of desires like that, and the one that's not edifying, not as helpful, not as excellent, not as virtuous is winning, you do have to turn away from that. So part of the goal setting and the routine setting is understanding these are not helpful things, which I used to have, I think, all of those subscription services, and now I got some of them so I could watch some sporting events, but I just can't binge watch things anymore. It just like eats at my soul. And so, if you're gonna binge something, binge a book series. It's so much better for you. It's the vegetables of entertainment.
Andy's got a lot of points. Just a couple of things real quick. Building
I'm
off
done.
of what Charlie's got. The page, when he's talking about read a page, at least a page, okay? So if you're reading a fiction book, a lot of times you read at least a page, okay? If you're doing like a nonfiction title, read a chapter, all right? And read it the way that we talked about. And just blast through a chapter really quickly. And just do that on a regular daily basis. Okay.
Okay, I was comment on that. So
Yeah, you got to come.
I can't just listen to that.
Yeah.
So
All right.
I would say best practice is to not leave off in the middle of a chapter. Kind of the sentiment of the one page is instead of not reading
Yeah,
today,
this is not
I'm
best
going to
practice.
read something.
Yes, I would agree.
And hey, there's a lot of ways to read shorter things. Jumping on a blog, Challies or something like that, like reading an article online that
Yeah.
is maybe easier to access because it's on your phone as opposed to an actual book. Just the sentiment there is it's better for me to read something today than to be like, oh, well, I'll read the chapter tomorrow.
Okay.
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah.
the chapter will be 1 or 2 pages less if you read 1 or 2 pages today.
Mhm.
And what normally happens for me is I can't leave a book. It's something about the reading and you engaging your mind. You actually want to keep reading, and that's just a good, healthy thing. Like your mind being active. And so, if you, we could talk about boredom here too.
I think Andy's got like 4 points.
Okay, yeah,
I
I'll
don't.
shut up.
I don't need to give them all. That's fine.
Oh, give them all.
Well, I'll say this. Okay, so we'll shift to a new issue. So if you've read before and you found yourself reading and your mind wanders, so what do you do when your mind wanders? I think I thought of an illustration to answer that. So this is interactive. So you guys are in a conversation with someone. You're talking to a real person. Then we'll go to talk about reading, and you find your mind wandering as you talk with this other person. What is the scenario? Describe the scenario. Why does your mind start to wander in a physical conversation with a person? Think about that for a moment. I got 2 answers. You might come up with
The
more.
question is why?
Yeah, why? Like you and I are talking.
I'm uninterested in
or
the
you-
conversation.
Okay, you're uninterested. That's one. So it either, and why are you uninterested? There's 2 answers that I can think of why you might be uninterested.
So am I answering now? Why am I not interested?
Yeah. So you lose interest in the
Oh.
conversation and your mind starts to wander, but there's physically a person in front of you. I know this is happening. Someone's talking, droning on,
And
and
you just
you're
off in
losing
la la
interest. Yeah, you're
land.
kind of like your mind wanders. And then they ask you a question and you have to like try to figure out what they just said. Why did your mind wander?
You're distracted.
Okay, you're distracted.
You love something else instead.
Okay,
More.
you love something else instead. Okay.
You're fishing.
I am fishing.
We're not catching.
No, you're close. You're really close. Here's what I think it is. If you're in a conversation with a person and you find yourself mentally checking out, it's probably one of 2 things. One, whatever they're talking about is very not relevant to your life. So they're talking about fishing and you don't care a bit about fishing and you're trying to listen to be nice, but you're like, I don't care about this. And so you lose interest. Or like Charlie, you and I talk about something and Tim's like over here rolling his eyes. It's because it doesn't interest him. The second reason.
Fun and wholesome things.
Oh, well,
Tim doesn't like fun
Keep
and wholesome
going.
things.
Come back to the
The
conversation.
other thing I think that is probably true in those situations is the conversation has stopped being a conversation and it's turned into a monologue. The other person's talking and you're not getting a chance to say anything. There's no interacting.
Okay.
Now, take that to reading. I'm reading a chapter and I go a whole page and my mind wanders. Why? I'm not conversing with the author. I'm not writing notes. I'm not asking questions. I'm not engaging the author. I'm just letting the author talk to me. And so because the author's droning on, as it were, and I'm not doing this engaging with the author, asking questions, what do I think? Like at the end of the page, Charlie, you were saying this earlier. At the end of the page, ask, what did they just say? Do I agree? Do I not agree? You were telling all this about, like, you're talking to your students about that. So I think when you don't do that, you treat the author like they're just this monologuer in front of you.
Yeah.
And then secondly, when you don't ask questions, the book's not relevant because it's not interacting in your life.
Sure.
So I think that maybe a tip would be to make reading not a spectator sport, but a conversation. I would just say that. And you've already mentioned that, but I think it's worth saying in that illustration.
Yeah, it's good.
Just like a real conversation, I think it falls
so
apart because
thinking-
you're bored mentally.
A part of that, the relevancy thing is why is reading important? And I think we could easily justify, oh, I'm reading this commentary on the Bible. I'm
Mhm.
reading the Bible. I'm reading this theology book. I'm reading this thing for college. I'm learning things. So then what would you, we're getting kind of in our target zone of time. Maybe wrap up with this idea. How would we, I don't know, here's more tips.
That's fine.
Let's
I got
have
one more I'll mention.
Even more thoughts on reading.
Oh, yeah.
But so how then would we justify, or what is the relevancy of fiction?
Well, I would say the content is what I'm talking about, not the idea of reading.
You just
I'm
opened
saying
up a whole new can of
The
worms.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, we
Okay,
don't want to do
maybe
that.
Well,
we
if you're
table that
reading
one
and
then.
you're like, this isn't relevant, there's no point to this.
Well,
And so like I think there'd be a lot of people who would point to something like The Lord of the Rings and say, that's just not relevant.
Right. And so they're not ready to read something like that. And that gets back to his question. And this is something I recommend to people. Read something that you're interested in.
yes.
Okay, so this is a
Yep.
regular issue, especially even for grade school kids, which, I take my kids to the library. I'm like, this is what's nice about like a homeschool kind of a curriculum. You can tell the kid, I want you to pick the book. So then it's something that they want to learn, at least to a degree. Sometimes they just have to do it. And so read something that you want, that you're interested in, that intrigues you. And sometimes you need to curate your loves for the right kind of things. You might be wanting something that you shouldn't want, or that's something that's just like if you're reading fiction all the time. But anyway, I want to hear your other points.
I'll save them for another episode.
Oh,
Well, I mean, I do think it's okay to read fiction all the time, though. I mean, maybe not exclusively, but I think
to
as
read what?
fiction, like you.
Oh
kinda-
yeah, you can read fiction. That's fine. It shapes your affections. Make sure you read the good stuff. But
Yeah. Because I think that would be to answer my own question. Why is fiction relevant? Is your imagination is important.
But some people read too much fiction, and you need to be
Balanced.
thinking more. And fiction doesn't. Wow, some fiction can really make you
Read
think.
That Hideous Strength, brother.
Most fiction doesn't make you really
Boom.
think. So
Most kind of doesn't. Okay, so could we summarizing our practical tips?
So mine would be build your structure first. You got to build a mental structure. And if you don't, you're not having anywhere to hang your knowledge.
And that Tim was kind of your thought on don't focus on reading every word, but start with the headings and that type of thing. And mine, we got into goals and a routine. Then we kind of ended there with
When you said that difficult things always get easier the more you do them. Is
Yeah.
that how you said it? Yep. So I think like being consistent.
you're shaping the affections.
the repetition idea.
hmm
And then kind of our last big one there was
Have a conversation.
reading is not reading in a monologue sense, but
hmm
you're being very active in
Yes.
a conversation. Which there's this really old really old movie called The Page Master. where it's the kid from Home Alone.
Squirrel.
Is it? No, it's not. It's right on theme. Where he goes in this library in the middle of a storm, and then he like gets brought into this like cartoon story, but
Squirrel.
he's like talking to the books. So he like there's a pirate book,
Oh.
and there's like a
Oh.
scary ghoul
Mhm.
type of a book. But then he like goes into those stories, but he's like he's talking with the books in the story of the book. So he goes into Moby Dick and he's talking to like this like sea captain book. It's just interesting how he's like journeying through these things, but it's like in a very real sense, like he's doing this with the book, like with the author.
It's cold.
The whole point of that, go watch Pagemaster. Anyway,
I'd rather read a book.
well, I don't know if it's a book. Maybe that's the best way to end a podcast on reading is, hey, go watch this movie.
Horrendous.
Okay, well, there's some tips for you. We'll come back in another 60-something episodes and give you more tips. See you next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Thinklings podcast. We would love to hear from you. If you have any feedback, suggestions, or potential topics that you'd like us to discuss, you can contact us through our email, thinklingspodcast@gmail.com. Remember, don't let this conversation end with this podcast. Read good books, talk about them with your friends, and always continue to cultivate your mind. See you next time on the Thinklings podcast.